Good evening, friends. You are most welcome to Civil Affairs channel. Today we are going to discuss social anthropology by Maan IGNOU. Here we will discuss gender and society mane004, and our topic is women's movement in the colonial period. The women's movement in the colonial period are mainly of the two different concerns. First, social reform movement. Second, nationalist movement. Social reform movements. The women's movements began as a social reform movement in the 19th century. The British conquest and its rule over India brought about transformation in Indian economy as well as in society. The new land revenue settlements, commercial agriculture, and infrastructural facilities like roads, railways, postal and telegraph services, etc., ushered in by the British led to a significant change in the Indian village economy. The new economic system and administrative machinery required a new type of educated personnel, which resulted in the establishment of Western educational institutions imparting modern education. The Indian who were the beneficiaries of the new economic systems were attracted towards this, and as a result, a new class of intelligentsia involved in the Indian society. The articulate intelligentsia became a pioneer of all progressive democratic movements, social, political, economic, and cultural. The reform movements were not homogeneous and varied a lot in terms of the ideas and changes that was to be fostered. They did, however, share a common concern for rooting out the social evils, partly in response to charges of barbarity from the colonial rulers. This was a period of the hegemonic control and influence of colonial ideology. This was a time of transition, one of the emerging bourgeois society and values of the new mode of the thoughts. The colonial intervention in the 19th century intruded into the areas of our culture and society, and this affect transformation in our social fabric. This potential threat was sensed by the Indian intellectual reformers exposed to Western ideas and values. At this juncture, the Indian intellectual reformer, sensitive to the power of colonial domination and responding to Western ideas of rationalism and liberalism, sought ways and means of resisting this colonial hegemony by resorting to what Ken Panikkar Presidential Address Indian History Congress 1975 refers to as cultural defense. This cultural difference resulted in a paradoxical situation spurred by new European ideas of rationalism and progress. The reformers tried to create a new society modern yet rooted in Indian tradition. They began a critical appraisal of Indian society in an attempt to create a new ethos devoid of all overt social aberrations like polytheism, polygamy, casteism, sati, child marriage, illiteracy, etc., all of which they believed were impediments to progress of women. All the social reformers shared a belief common to many parts of the world in the 19th century that no society could progress if its women were backward. To the reformers, the position of Indian women as it was in the 19th century was abysmally low, and hence their efforts were directed at an overall improvement in the status of women through legislation, political action, and propagation of education. This was mainly spurred by the first wave feminism of the West and concentrated on the basic rights for women. The social reform movements did not radically challenge the existing patriarchal structure of society or question gender relation. They picked up for reform only those issues which the British were pointing out as evidence of degeneration in the Indian society. Even the women's institutions and organizations that sprang up during this period do not reveal the development of an independent view. As a result, even when women were speaking for themselves, they were speaking only the language of the men, defined by male parameters. Women were seen as passive recipients of a more humanitarian treatment to be given by Western educated elite men. There was thus an attempt to reform women rather than reform the social conditions which opposed them. There were no attempts to alter the power structure and the man woman relation in the society. This was but natural, since the change in the status of women was being sought only within questioning patriarchy itself. The attempt was to create a new Indian woman, truly Indian and yet sufficiently educated and tutored in the 19th century values to suit the new emerging society. Thus, education for girls was not meant to equip them to be self sufficient, independent, and emancipated, and train them to follow some profession, but to be good housewives. Pandey and Kameshwari, 1987. Women also joined in the struggle against colonialism, but while they were encouraged to participate by the leaders like Gandhi, their work in the struggle was just an extension of their domestic work. Very few women were allowed to join the the front ranks with men, and the ones that did spoke of the isolation they felt at times. Kumar, 1993. As a form of backlash to these ideas, the new ideas that colonialism brought to India, women's role were being pushed to a more traditional way of life. In spite of its limitation, it cannot be denied that the social reform movement did help in removing prejudices against women's education and provided a space for women in the public realm. The reformer took up issues such as sati, female infanticide, polygamy, child marriage, parda, absence of education among women, etc. There were two groups of social reformers, liberal reformers and the revivalists. Both the groups undoubtedly recognized the oppressive social institutions custom of India. But the former group, on the basis of liberal philosophy, put forth their work for the cause of women, whereas the latter group's work was based on a program of revival at the Vedic society in modern India. While arguing in favor of equal rights for women, appealed to logic, reason, history, the principle of individual freedom, and the requirements of social program. Social reformers such as Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Keshav Chandra Sen, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Kandukuri, Veera Salingam Panthulu, M.G. Ranade, Karve, Swami Vivekanand or Vivekanantiya, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, and others provided leadership to the women's movement by frankly acknowledging the degradation or degraded position of Indian women. The social reformers concentrated their attention on important aspects of women like sati, age of marriage, that sad plight of widows, and their right to remarry. The social reformers established a number of societies like Brahma Samaj, Ramakrishna Mission, and others for the cause of Indian women. The best exponent of liberalism was Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who was the first Indian to initiate a social reform movement and campaign for the cause of women. He advocated equality between the two sexes and declared that women were not inferior to men morally and intellectually. Roy's attention was drawn towards the inhuman practice of sati after female infanticide. From 1818 onwards, he began his active propaganda through speeches and writings against sati, largely because of his effort and persuasions. The East India Company declared the sati practice illegal and punishable, a punishable offence in 1829. Rajaram Mohan Roy also opposed other evils like early marriage, polygamy, etc. He supported female education and widow and intercaste marriage. He wanted that women should have the right of inheritance and property. Roy's Brahma Samaj played a significant role in the reform activities concerning women. The Brahma Samaj, soon after its inception, became a vigorous social reform movement, first in Bengal, which then quickly spread to other parts of the country and added to the volume and strength of similarly aimed local reformist movements. The members of the Brahma Samaj opposed the caste system, and they concentrated greatly on improving the low conditions of women and played a very important role in the introduction of several beneficial measures like Raja Ram Mohan Rai, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar also helped women. He did so by propagating widow remarriage. The child marriage evil resulted in large numbers of the young girls ending up as widows whose lives were miserable due to the severe restrictions imposed on them. He argued in favor of widow remarriages and published his work on widow remarriages in 1853. Arya Samaj was established by Dayanand Saraswati in 1875. Dayanand Saraswati emphasized compulsory education of both boys and girls. A series of schools for women, Arya Kanya Pathshalas, were the first concerted effort of the Samaj to promote women's education in a systematic way. Prarthana Samaj, founded by some Maharashtra Brahmins in 1867, had leaders like M.G. Ranade, N.G. Chandra Sarkar, and R.G. Bhandarkar. It concentrated more on sponsoring education for women. Both Brahma Samaj and Prarthana Samaj made forceful efforts to prove the Hindu religious tradition was not the source of legitimacy for the sorrowful condition of women in society. Under the influence of liberal thought of the West, the two Samas strove to restore to women their dignified status. The efforts of the Vidyasagar, Keshav Chandra Sen and D.K. Karve resulted in the enactment of Widow Remarriage Act of 1856. In the south, Kandukuri Veera Salingam led the widow remarriage movement. In 1874, he performed 63 widow remarriages throughout the Madras Presidency and financially supported men who married widows by providing them houses and other benefits. Another aspect that the reformers worked on was the age of girls at marriage. In the 19th century, the average age of marriage for girls was 8 or 9. The extensive propaganda by Vidyasagar and other reformers in this regard led the British government to legislate in order to improve the condition of minor girls, and the age of the consent bill was passed in 1860, which made sexual intercourse with a girl of less than 10 years of the age as rape. Further social reformers like Mahadev Govind Ranade or Behramji Malabari, and Tej Bahadur Sapru, in their attempts to raise the age of marriage, cited several cases of consummation at the age of 10 or 11, which led to serious physical and psychological disturbances. Behramji, a Parsi journalist, published his notes on infant marriage and enforced widowhood in 1884, suggesting certain reforms to be adopted in the educational institutions to discourage child marriage, and also suggested some corrective measures to the government. It was between 1884 to 1889 that enormous pressure was it was between 1884 and 1889 that enormous pressure was brought to bear on the government to enact a law to further raise the age at marriage of the girl. At last, due to the collective efforts the reformers in 1891, the bill known as the age of consent was passed, which rose the marriageable age for girls to 12 years. The social reformers felt that through female education, the social evils that were linked to the issue of preserving and strengthening basic family structure could be eliminated, and good wives and mothers could emerge from the same, starting from Raja Ram Mohan Rai, including the liberal as well as orthodox reformers supported female education. This resulted in the establishment of schools for girls and homes for widows between 1855 and 1858. While he was inspector of schools, Vidyasagar established 48 girls' schools. M.G. Ranade, along with his wife, propagated female education and started a girl high school in 1884. The limited enforcement and practicability of legislations like Widow Remarriage Act of 1856 and others in the tradition bound society was recognized by D.K. Karve, who therefore concentrated his efforts on promoting education among widows. In 1896, Karve, along with 15 of his colleagues, founded the Anant Balika, Balika Ashram, Balika Ashram, Anant Balika Ashram for the education of widows. In 1896, Karve, along with 15 of his colleagues, founded the Anant Balika Ashram for the education of widows, where the courts were drawn up with an idea to make the widows self reliant. He also started Mahila Vidyalaya in 1907 and S&DT Women's University in 1916, a separate educational institution for women, so as to lessen the resistance of orthodox section with regard to women's education. The social reform movement in its later phase resulted in producing women social reformers who worked for their own cause. Pandita Ramabai started Sharda Sadan in Bombay in 1889 to provide an ashram to destitute high caste widows. In 1912-13, a widow home was established by Sister Subbu Lakshmi, another widow in Madras. Another important aspect of social reform movement phase of women in India was that of property rights for Hindu women. Mukherjee 1975. The existing practice was particularly harsh on Hindu widow who had no claim on her husband's property except the right at maintenance, as a result of which she was at the mercy of her husband's relatives. Raja Ram Mohan Roy suggested that the government should enact and enforce laws to remove these disabilities and bring economic freedom and self-reliance. As a result of such efforts, a Special Marriage Act of 1872 with its provision for divorce and succession to property to women was passed. The Married Women's Property Act of 1874 widened the scope of Stridhan, women's property, and expanded the right to own and acquire property by women. It also gave a widow a life interest in her husband's share of the property and a share equal to that of son. Swami Vivekananda, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, and Annie Besant were the prominent reformers of the revivalist group who also worked for the cause of Indian women. This group believed in the revival of the Vedic society in modern India. Dayanand Saraswati, the founder of Arya Samaj, was against child marriage. He encouraged widow remarriages and also set up several rescue homes and orphanages. Annie Besant, leader of the Theosophical movement, was also against child marriages and supported remarriages of child widows. She laid emphasis on the importance of female education, thus adding strength to the social reform movement. Muslim women in India made little progress in their position both in the pre-British period or later British period. Western education, the major vehicle of progress during the British period, did not reach them, partly because of existence of parda and seclusion of women from external environment and partly because education was considered inessential for them. Educated Muslims formed only a small segment of the population in the 19th century and were confined to urban areas in the country. Consequently, efforts in education and association formation among Muslim women did not begin until the 20th century, with notable exception being the Tayyabji family of Bombay. Badruddin Tayyabji, who graduated from Elphinstone College, founded a Muslim self-help association in 1876. His female relatives were later active in the starting a Muslim girls' school, Amina Binte Badruddin Tayyabji, and running a girls' orphanage, Begum Nawale Mishra, and starting nursing centers, Sharifa Hamid Ali. Thus, the social reformers laid the foundation of The women's movement in India, social reform movement, was the first attempt to remove the obstacle in the life of women. It created awareness among the people that women must be liberated and be made equal of the men. Thank